Let's get more now on our top story. According to new reports, officials in Brussels are said to be working on the basis that Boris Johnson isn't bluffing and that the UK will leave the EU without an agreement. I'm joined now by the chief leader writer at The Observer and former senior policy advisor to Ed Miliband, Sonia Sodha, and also the former Downing Street communications director, Jonathan Haslam. Welcome to you both. Sonia, to you first of all, the EU now does accept that Boris Johnson is not bluffing. How significant do you think that is?
Well, I think it's really significant, actually. I think what's emerged out of Brussels and European capitals over the last couple of days is this sense that actually when Boris Johnson said, there's no sort of new withdrawal agreement unless the EU unconditionally drops the backstop, I think they've realised that actually he was pretty serious when he said that. So I think it's very significant.
Jonathan Haslam, do you think this is going to change anything? That they now appear to actually believe what Boris Johnson has been saying?
I don't think that they've had any doubt in the past about the firmness of his intent. He seems to be a man who's betting everything on either red or black, choose your colour. And he hasn't really got anywhere else to go. He's drawn up so many hard lines for his own negotiating stance, so are very clear to the European Union all the way through the issues of the leadership. They may have been slightly confused, I suppose, and it's reasonable to be so, because this was a man who, first of all, was unflattering about Theresa May's Chequers deal when it was unveiled. He then resigned, having accepted it a couple of days later on. He then voted against the withdrawal agreement twice and then voted for it. So they could have been forgiven for being a little bit unsettled and by what they see. But now I think all the rhetoric points towards a very hard position at the moment. I don't see them blinking, frankly. There's too much at stake for them. And from the UK's point of view, getting out by the 31st is the mantra. Johnson has to do that, or he's trash, basically.
Sonia, you're nodding along there. You don't see them blinking either. But number 10 does say it is willing to negotiate. What chances do you think the EU would actually be interested in doing that back?
Well, I think officials will sort of look at that so-called willingness to negotiate and think of it as rather hollow. So the withdrawal agreement that was negotiated with Theresa May, it took a number of years to come to that agreement, many sort of hours and hours of negotiation with EU officials. And what's important to understand is that the EU itself regards the backstop as quite a good position for the UK. It's a compromise, it's a significant compromise from the EU, sort of allowing access to some of the single market in goods, making sure there's no border in Ireland, without lots of the rules that come along with being part of the single market in goods. So for the EU, it was always a compromise position. And I think officials there have been sort of caught by surprise how quickly the backstop became very, very politically toxic. So I think when they say we're not reopening this agreement, they've said that for two reasons, essentially, if you look at what the EU's reasoning is. The first is, they appear to actually be taking their obligations under the Good Friday Agreement more seriously than the UK in some ways. They absolutely want to avoid a border on the island of Ireland. But the second really important reason is that the EU needs to protect the integrity of the single market, because if they don't, that could be the signal to other countries. Well, if you were to vote to leave the EU, you could do so. You could get away without paying into the EU budget, without going along with the rules, and you could still get some quite preferential access to the single market. So I think for both of those reasons, the EU is unlikely to budge on the backstop. It sees it as a compromise agreement. And, I think EU officials have been taken by surprise, some of the briefing that's coming out of Brussels suggests, by the fact that, the British government, David Frost, Boris Johnson's EU negotiator, kind of rocked up in Brussels in the last few days. And although he said we don't want the backstop, there was no constructive solution on the table for avoiding a border in Ireland either. He acknowledged that if Brexit's going to happen on the 31st of October, there simply won't be a technological solution ready. So I don't think the EU are going to budge on it.
Jonathan, do you think Boris Johnson should have gone to Europe by now?
Well, I think the tactic there is that he doesn't want to be seen as, in any sense, a supplicant. So if he goes there and gets rebuffed by Macron or Angela Merkel, that is bad for his domestic showing. I mean, clearly he is looking at bolstering the domestic situation because he has to have an election fairly soon. It's just untenable to try to run a government with a majority currently at one when you're also hand in glove with the DUP. So he is looking very much more at this end of things. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects of this absolute conundrum. A complete and utter failure from certainly the UK side to negotiate effectively. What we have at the moment is the possibility of gunboat negotiation, i.e. you give in, we tell you what we want and you give it in. They don't seem to realise that actually when the Vote Leave said it wanted to have more control of its borders, it is perfectly reasonable for the European Union to say the same. And as Sonia has said very clearly, actually what the European Union has done over the backstop is compromise. And when we say we don't want it, we don't put forward anything other than those airy-fairy ideas of alternative arrangements. People need a bit more certainty in that. And the huge, disappointing and possibly tragic outcome here is that you might avoid the Irish backstop issue and you'll end up with one in any case. The thing you want to avoid, you end up because of intransigence.
Sonia, Jonathan mentioned an election he believes is inevitable soon. Do you feel the same?
Yes, I agree. It feels like since Boris Johnson has become Prime Minister, everything has been about gearing up towards a general election. And I think we'll either see Boris Johnson sort of swerve away from his pledge not to call a general election in the autumn. So he may decide to kind of get out ahead of any parliamentary conflict in the autumn and call one proactively. But I think if he doesn't, I think there's an extremely good chance that we'll end up with a general election as a result of a big parliamentary showdown we're going to see. I think the UK government's working assumption does now seem to be, as has EU officials have been told, they've been told that the central assumption of the UK government seems to be a No Deal Brexit. It does feel like that is the assumption of Boris Johnson's number 10. And Parliament is going to try very, very hard to block that. We know there's a majority of MPs in Parliament who are against No Deal. There's a question about how far will they go, in particularly Conservative moderates who don't want to see no deal happen. Would they vote against a Boris Johnson government in a vote of no confidence? There's a question of even if you have a vote of no confidence passing, can that block a no deal Brexit? But there's going to be huge fireworks around that, I think, in the autumn, and an election is very likely to be the result.
Jonathan, we're talking about the vote of no confidence. A lot of speculation in the papers today that Boris Johnson will just stay on even if he loses it. Is that possible?
Oh, it's certainly possible. I think the Institute for Government and other think tanks that look at these matters in detail have come to that conclusion. But I think it also needs to bear in mind just how high the stakes are here. Because if he was given a vote of no confidence and held on and called an election where the polling date would be after the 31st of October, therefore pitchforking us into a situation, I think the constitutional outrage in the country would be such that you could promote the sort of civil disobedience that I saw when I walked through the poll tax riot in London, that we saw in 2011 on Boris Johnson's watch as London mayor. And I'm not a doomster and a gloomster. I'm a Remainer who has become resigned to leaving, but leaving in good order. And I think that those people in Downing Street at the moment really need to think very, very carefully about the stakes. And I don't actually get the impression they are. I think there's too much zealotry. And I'd like people just to take a sharp intake of breath and pause for a bit.
Sonia, do you think that's possible, that there could be civil disobedience if we see ignoring of a vote of no confidence?
I think that's quite a likelihood.
Sorry, Jonathan, I was just
Sorry,
Jonathan, I was just putting that to Sonia, asking her to comment on your point.
I mean, it's a possibility. I mean, I think it would take us into such uncharted constitutional territory, essentially. If you've got Parliament voting a vote of no confidence and then Boris Johnson just sort of simply refusing to resign and calling a general election for after we've left, I mean, that is just unprecedented constitutional waters, really. So there's a chance that that there may be some sort of civil disobedience. But I think it will really, really put the unwritten British constitution under strain, because you'll have this extraordinary situation where Parliament has made its express views about something known. And after all, we live in a parliamentary democracy. Parliament is sovereign. In fact, this is why the Leave campaigners wanted to leave the European Union, to restore sovereignty to Parliament. But you've got a Prime Minister, a pro-Brexit Prime Minister, who's saying, well, I'm sorry, I'm just going to ignore Parliament of what MPs think. And that would, I think, take us into some really, really difficult, dangerous and worrying territory in terms of how our democracy works.
It's going to be a busy few months in the world of politics. Sonia and Jonathan, thank you both very much indeed.